In Transaction, Barbara Satin makes several recommendations of things that congregations can do to become more trans-friendly and trans-welcoming. I'm going to read that list. I invite us to listen as a spiritual practice. When you hear something that Welcome Table has done already, hold it in your heart with gratitude. Maybe hold your hands out and imagine it resting in your hands and bring it to your heart. When you hear something we have done partially, but not completely, listen and wonder how we can step further into it. When you hear something we do, but not well, again, listen and wonder how Spirit is calling us into more and better welcome. When you hear something we haven't done, listen. Is Spirit calling us to that work now? How is Spirit calling you to participate or facilitate that work now? When you hear something that doesn't sit right with you, hold it in curiosity and wonder. I wonder why I'm feeling this way. I wonder what Spirit has for me in these words. A list of suggestions can certainly be a spiritual practice, so I invite us to deep breathing and deep listening to this list of suggestions as a spiritual practice. First, she says, address how you ask questions. The first question to ask about someone else's gender is, do I really need to know? In most situations, it's not necessary to know anything about a person's gender in order to include and welcome them. For example, if someone walks into a worship service and his or her or their gender is unclear, there is rarely any reason to ask or comment on this. The person is there to pray and be in community. If you decide that you do need to understand more about someone's gender, appropriate and respectful questions include, what are your pronouns? Is there anything I or the community can do to make this a comfortable place for you? It is absolutely inappropriate to ask any transgender person about their body or their medical history, just as it's inappropriate to ask anyone. These questions, what is your pronoun? And is there anything I or the community can do to make this place more comfortable for you? Is a question we can ask anyone. A question we should ask anyone. So again, the first question to ask about someone else's gender is, do I really need to know? The second thing Barbara addresses is education. She says to repeat this curriculum, Transaction, for others in your congregation. Now, the curriculum is old and we have altered it to be more up to date, but we will be putting it in the Messenger as well as some other pieces. We can also engage other forms of education together and share what we learn, invite others to join. She recommends inviting the whole community to a panel discussion or a workshop or another event that will offer information and open up dialogue about our transgender siblings and how best to welcome, support, and celebrate them. Next, she suggests we offer an adult education class or a sermon about gender diversity in biblical texts. She suggests that we advertise, host, or co-sponsor other organizations' transgender-related programs. For example, before COVID, we hosted the Transgender Day of Remembrance in our sanctuary. What other things along these lines could we do? Who could be our partners? For example, At the end of every Pride Month, we take a special offering for an organization related to LGBT plus concerns and empowerment. Today, we will take a special offering for Trans Women of Color Solidarity Network. What other partnerships could we have? Finally, regarding education, she says that we should assess the messages conveyed in our religious education, and particularly our children's program, about gender and gender roles. While we are mindful of these things, it is always good to assess the messages conveyed. Make sure that there is support and representation for trans and gender non-conforming children and parents. A friend of mine who is a counselor, a theologian, and an educator suggested that churches should have, regardless of the age of your congregation, should have at the ready resources for parents of children who are coming out, particularly as trans, and resources for children attempting to come out, particularly as trans. Barbara says, make sure there is support for trans and gender non-conforming children and parents. Third, she says, create a non-gender specific restroom that is available to everyone. If you already have a single stall restroom in your building, this can be easily accomplished by covering the men or women sign with an all-gender restroom sign. This applies to temporary, shared, or rental facilities as well. Let's take a moment of gratitude that our building has all-gender restrooms and has always had all-gender restrooms. Let's hold a moment of gratitude that when we noticed that we had a sign that represented men and women, but no space for non-binary or non-gender conforming persons, we immediately fixed that by making them simply all gender restrooms and signage that represents that as well. In discussing restrooms, Barbara brings up this important point. Remember that some transgender people may not be quote-unquote out to the rest of the world and are uncomfortable or afraid to be seen in public in their transgender persona. So having a private place for these people to change before or after services or meetings may be a meaningful signal from our congregation that we are fully welcome. Such a facility may not be necessary or used frequently, but consider planning for this possibility. As I listen to this recommendation, I find myself wondering how wonderful it could be to show people that we have thought about the possibility that worship may be the only place they feel comfortable being themselves right now. What if we intentionally communicated that by providing a space? Number 4, language. Let people know that you are trans-inclusive by using welcoming language. This is very important in newsletters, event announcements, sermons, etc. Instead of saying things like, this event welcomes men and women, try saying, all genders are welcome. Rather than saying both men and women, try saying people of all genders. Saying that your community welcomes everyone is really not enough. Research shows that transgender as well as gay, lesbian, and bisexual people often assume the word everyone does not include them. Be sure to always be asking about your language. How could our language be more inclusive? What is our growing edge with our language to be more inclusive of people of all genders and families of all shapes and sizes? Five, include gender identity and gender expression in your non-discriminatory and anti-harassment policies. Be sure your bylaws are trans-inclusive and don't limit individual involvement because of gender-restrictive language. This invites us to read through all of our policies and make sure that there is no binary limiting language, and make that change to include and welcome and empower all. Six, outreach. Create an outreach plan that includes the changes your community is making. Remember that the world at large is not very welcoming to transgender folks. Therefore, trans people often assume that they are not welcome or not included in your community unless it is clearly stated otherwise. Publicize the trans-inclusive steps that your community has taken, as well as the programs you are planning. This lets trans people know that your community really cares about being an affirming place for them. Try to tell them your story through various media outlets, social media outlets that reach out to the LGBT+ community. Number 7, political and social action. Include trans and gender diversity issues as a part of your community's social action work. Support transgender community services and advocacy organizations. Learn about local laws regarding hate crimes, name changes, changing gender markers on legal documents, discrimination such as employment and housing. Learn about and support federal and local legislation that empowers trans folks and ends discrimination. Number 8, ritual. Be prepared to incorporate or develop new rituals or adapt existing ones in order to be trans inclusive. How comfortable might a trans person be marking a wedding, a baptism, a loss, or other life cycle events in your congregation? How open could they be to talking about their identity from the pulpit or altar? Transgender people often experience unique life cycle events such as moments of gender transition or a name change. Have you created liturgies for these? Have you expressed as outreach that you have created liturgies for these? Support transgender events where liturgy may be an appropriate element. For example, the Transgender Day of Remembrance, held every November. It is an annual recognition of the violence faced by transgender people. While this gathering is to remember those who have been killed in the past 12 months, it is not designed to be a religious event, but there can be a role for your congregation to show its support against violence aimed at transgender persons during a regular worship service around that time, or again, as we did before COVID, could our building host this event again? If you're watching on YouTube, I invite you to take a moment listening for which of these things you feel called to, which of these things you feel we have done and you are grateful for, which of these things we need to step further into, which of these things you have energy for. If you are watching on YouTube, I invite you to pause and wonder what else is missing on this list. If you're joining us on Zoom, we will pause this video now to have this discussion.